History as it happens, July 26, 2022. The Declinists.
It's clear that the true problems of our nation are much deeper than gasoline lines or energy shortages, deeper even than inflation or recession.
This is a victory for democracy and freedom. It's a victory for the moral force of our values.
Shining city upon a hill. The phrase comes from John Winthrop, who wrote it to describe the America he imagined.
In this election, we cannot afford the same political games and tactics that are being used to pit us against one another, to make us afraid of one another. The stakes are too high to divide us.
Our political divisions seem intractable, our problems unsolvable. We have inflation and crime and spiritual decay at home and failed wars overseas. The United States, like Rome before it, once reached the pinnacle of power, but is now in decline, or so the declinists say. But not Michael Kimmage, and he's next as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
And I'm sending a clear message to the world. America is back.
Prices are up 9.1% over the past year. That's the highest level in 40 years.
Against the backdrop of an increasingly dominant China, has led many to believe America is losing its power and standing in the world.
With the Taliban in charge, 2,461 Americans died in America's longest war.
Los Angeles is dealing with a spike in brazen and sometimes deadly robberies. From high-end stores.
But even before COVID, a growing number of Americans were moving away from organized religion.
And what I can say with real confidence, it's in the eye of the beholder how grave you think the country's problems are and what you think the solutions are. But decline is a very, very imprecise, confusing, unclear term.
So we found something that Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals, believers and atheists may agree on. America is in trouble. America is in decline. China's going to catch our economy. We can't win wars anymore. The Supreme Court is taking away our rights. Crime is out of control. People are rejecting God. Well, whether you agree that some or all of these complaints signify decline, you get my point. Things seem bleak right now. Well, that's not new. The same dark clouds hovered above the country in the late 1970s, and President Carter implored Americans to straighten themselves out.
In a nation that was proud of hard work, strong families, close-knit communities, and our faith in God, too many of us now tend to worship self-indulgence and consumption. Human identity is no longer defined by what one does, but by what one owns.
Now, a little more than a decade after that, it appeared America was back on top again. The Soviet Union was gone, we won the Cold War, and freedom was on the march.
Every American can take pride in this victory, from the millions of men and women who've served our country in uniform to millions of Americans who supported their country and a strong defense under 9 presidents.
So what happened since then? Why do so many Americans feel like we're on the decline again? When only 30 years ago it appeared nothing could stop capitalism, freedom, and democracy. Well, empires, if you wish to call the United States an empire, are weakened by overextension, by hubris. So if you subscribe to the notion that we're going the way of Rome, the U.S. response after 9/11 may be a good place to start.
In the Battle of Iraq, the United States and our allies have prevailed.
Compare the national mood when President Bush declared, or at least the banner behind him on that aircraft carrier read, "Mission accomplished," to the mood today, just a year after the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan in defeat. Is that a sign of military decline? What about economic decline or cultural, artistic? There are a lot of ways to look at this. Is it even possible to answer these questions in the moment? After all, decline is not an event, it's a process. In an essay in the journal Liberties, our guest today wrote, "Declinism is valid insofar as it consists in the recognition of actual problems. But it honors the problems too much. It merges them into a fate and prefers the consequent fatalism to an educated hope. Strangely, a narrative of decline also soothes. It rescues us from our challenges, and it comforts us with the certitude that tomorrow's problems will be worse than today's." That is our guest writing in the journal Liberties. Catholic University historian Michael Kimmage specializes in the history of the Cold War and in U.S.-Russian relations since 1991. From 2014 to 16, he served on the Secretary's policy planning staff at the State Department, where he held the Russia-Ukraine portfolio. Michael Kimmage, welcome back.
Great to be back, Martin.
So your essay, your thought-provoking essay in Liberties, titled The Rise of Decline, landed at a good time. I've been discussing these issues on my podcast recently in the context of the war in Ukraine and the U.S. role in it, how the U.S. administration, the foreign policy establishment, of which you were once a member, public intellectuals are framing the war as an opportunity for the United States to reassert its leadership on the global stage. Amid this larger debate about whether the U.S. is in decline, and you're on a mission to take on the declinists. It's not that you're ignoring real problems that we're facing, but you think decline is overrated.
Yes, I do think that decline is overrated, probably exaggerated. And what I can say with real confidence, it's in the eye of the beholder how grave you think the country's problems are and what you think the solutions are. But decline is a very, very imprecise, confusing, unclear term. And my first, sort of worry, or the reason that I wrote the essay, is I think that people throw it around a lot and are not very clear in their own minds as to what they mean. It sounds profound. It sounds serious. It's an attention-getting claim to say that the U.S. is in decline. But it's often very unclear what's meant by that. And let me add a second point that just struck me as interesting, that you have at the moment on the political left, on the political right, and in the center, three separate arguments for decline that are all in contradiction with each other. Doesn't mean that they're wrong, but it's just that there's this imprecision, there's this confusion. So that was really the first point that I wanted to make. Let's slow down. Let's try to be clear. Let's try to figure out what's meant simply when we use the word decline.
Well, for some people, decline begins when the party they don't like gets into the White House.
Exactly. That's in some respects the heart of the matter. When things that you don't like are happening, there's a tendency to attribute that to decline. But is it really true?
You say it's become a trope in political discourse, and maybe I've fallen victim to that myself. I do think American hegemony is waning, whether that means the U.S. is in decline. And how do we define the U.S.? Are we talking about military power, economic power, our society? I mean, there's a lot of layers to this. How would you define decline?
I still don't myself know exactly how to define it. And it follows exactly from what you're saying, Martin, that if you speak about military power, it's, I think, self-evident that the U.S. remains far unrivaled, even by China, in terms of its military power. But there, perhaps you could speak of relative decline, that 30 years ago, the U.S. was way ahead of everybody, and now some other powers have risen up. But,
like Paul Kennedy in his book in the 1980s. We'll get to that later. Go ahead.
Right. But that, to me, is not a sign of chronic decline. That's, sort of more of an adjustment or a readjustment on the international stage. Is the U.S. in economic decline? I don't know exactly what that means. I mean, there are higher levels of debt, so that's a possible argument for decline. But you have a lot of other indices, unemployment, economic growth, that aren't at the moment in a downward trajectory. So there, it's not very clear to me. Cultural and moral decline is an important subject. We can, certainly get to that, but I find that even more difficult to define than economic or military decline. So what I do in the essay, because I can't really come up with a good definition myself, is I turn to the great historian of this topic, Edward Gibbon, who in the 1780s published a multi-volume history of the Roman Empire, and he titled it The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. So I thought, if I can't figure it out, let me go to somebody who did figure it out, and let me try to use Gibbon to at least give a bit of structure and clarity to the subject.
And moral decline is in the eye of the beholder. And I also think when you're living in the moment and you're reacting to each and every political development, Monday to Tuesday to Wednesday to Thursday, I mean, that's not a way to measure decline. We're talking about forces that develop over the course of years, decades, even centuries, right? And it's not that decline isn't real. You brought up Gibbon, so I was going to ask you about Gibbon, so we'll get to it right now. There was once a Roman Empire. It declined and it's gone, right? So it's not like this isn't real. It's not a phantom. So how might the decline of Rome apply to our current situation? Or maybe we should start with, what were Gibbon's definitions? I think he said there were three main reasons for Rome's decline.
No, exactly. I think it's very helpful to use Gibbon. And obviously, there are many, many things that separate the United States in 2022 from the Roman Republic or the Roman Empire. That should be taken as a given. So there are lots of differences, but I think Gibbon is a really useful guide in this respect. And so Gibbon offers us three reasons in his huge history for the decline of the Roman Empire. Let me emphasize here Roman Empire, because the founders of the American Republic were obsessed with the decline of the Roman Republic and the fall of the Roman Republic and the rise of the Roman Empire, but they were not preoccupied by the decline of the Roman Empire. That was Gibbon's concern. So
that's because republics die in their infancy was the founders' concern.
Definitely. No. And they had seen the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth or Republic disappear before their eyes. It sort of was wiped from the map at exactly the time the U.S. was being founded as a republic. So it was one of their overriding concerns. Federalist Papers is a meditation on how you get a republic and keep it. But Gibbon was after something else in the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. The first reason he gave is a very familiar one, and you mentioned Paul Kennedy, and this is something that he thought a lot about in his book, The Rise and Fall of Great Powers, that was published in the 1980s. This is imperial overreach. So Gibbon noted that the Roman Empire became too big. It was increasingly difficult to defend. It had more and more enemies, and that this was, in the end, a source of great weakness or the source of vulnerability. Secondly, Gibbon notes the gradual disappearance of the Roman Senate. And I don't think it's quite checks and balances that he had in mind, but I think in his view, the Senate was a kind of anchor to Roman politics. And at a certain point, various emperors just completely overrode the power of the Senate. And that, for Gibbon, was not a good development. And then thirdly, this is probably the hardest part of the story to capture for Gibbon's history, he speaks of a kind of intellectual decline, that at a certain point in the early days of the Roman Empire, language was used clearly and precisely. There was a high level of education among the Roman emperors, the Roman political elite. And in Gibbon's view, that sort of deteriorated over time and things became more unclear, more fuzzy. Use of language was not as intelligent or not as effective in the later years. And that intrigues me, but it's a difficult point to relate as clearly as the other two, the loss of the Senate and imperial overreach.
So have Gibbon's arguments held up well over the past couple of centuries? Are they even applicable to anything today?
Well, I think they're very much applicable to a set of general questions or problems in American life or American politics. And, I think others might be more pessimistic than I am. But I will say on two of the three accounts, I think that the U.S. is doing more or less okay. On one of the accounts, I'm a little bit more troubled. So I would say when it comes to empire, there seem to me a lot of important differences between what Gibbon was describing and what the U.S. is. Some people talk about the U.S. as an empire. I'm not so convinced about that. I think that the U.S.
Why not?
Well, because I think that, there's a lot of influence that the U.S. has, a lot of power. It's a very large territory. It stretches into the Pacific Ocean with places like Guam and military bases and such. But on balance, I think that the U.S. exerts real political control over its own citizens, and the kind of control it has elsewhere is not, to me, imperial. But that's a sort of long and intricate argument.
Well, why don't we stay with it for a moment, if you don't
Sure.
mind? So I use empire to describe the United States. You're free to disagree with me. We're not the British Empire or the French Empire or the Roman Empire. We have our own way of doing empire, if you will. Before we had an overseas empire, we had a continental empire. The North American continent was viewed by white European settlers as an empty expanse tailor-made for European settlement. So that was our first empire, an empire of liberty, to borrow the title of Gordon Wood's great book in the Oxford History of the United States. And then we expanded to an overseas empire. But you're right, it's not coercive like the British Empire in India. It's not boots-on-the-ground imperialism. But through the post-World War II period, the United States was able to exert its influence by using the CIA to trample the principle of national sovereignty and universal human rights. We have 800 or so military bases, nuclear submarines, aircraft carriers, and we can project our military force over any part of the planet anytime we want. So I think for those reasons, the United States fits the definition of empire.
No, those are all very fair points, and there are definitely moments in U.S. history when it's been explicit. So, Spanish-American War, 1898, the U.S. acquires the Philippines and other places as formal colonies. So, you're entirely right that there are imperial elements to U.S. politics, foreign policy, and American history. To me, it doesn't go the full direction into empire, but we can agree to disagree about
Sure.
that. I think where I think going back to Gibbon, where to me the U.S. looks good. First of all, it's really able to defend itself. There were lots of concerns after 9/11 about perpetual terrorism and the kind of breakdown that it might cause. I really don't see any direct threats to the U.S. homeland, and I don't see them in the foreseeable future. There are lots of foreign policy challenges and problems that are out there, but the U.S. is really very capable of defending itself. That's not the case in the Roman Empire that Gibbon describes. It's being overrun at many points, sort of the famous image of the barbarians at the gate and such, but it really was being overrun in its later centuries by a host of sort of outside enemies. And secondly, I think when it comes to the U.S. in terms of its power, its role in the world, I think it's free to choose. And I'm happy that there has been this debate since 2016 in the election of Donald Trump, who obviously had a very different take on foreign policy than a lot of DC experts do. But I'm happy that there is this debate now about how much should it be? How far should it go? What's the right balance? How much money should be spent on defense? Does the U.S. have to get involved if there's a war or if there's a crisis in the Middle East or elsewhere? How much is too much? And I would just emphasize the freedom that we have there as citizens. It's possible that we could go in the direction of imperial overreach. That's definitely not to be written off. But there are a lot of choices that we can make. And it seems like we're just in a much, much better position than the Roman Empire was in its regard. And I think to a degree, we still have the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans to thank for that. But the choice is ours. I'll make that point again. The choice is ours about the scope of our outside involvement in the world, and it's up to us to choose wisely.
Well, I think what you're saying is any decline, if we are in decline, is not inevitable when it comes to overreach. So, again, we're in the moment here. So in 10 or 20 years, I might look back at what I'm saying to you today and say, gosh, was I wrong about that? But if we're going to start charting American decline after the end of the Cold War. I mean, the aftermath of 9/11 is a good place to start with overreach. A 20-year occupation of Afghanistan, the invasion of Iraq, all the other meddling in the Middle East that has weakened the United States' position there. We've lost trillions of dollars when you add up the costs of war over the many decades to come, treating veterans, hundreds of thousands of deaths across the region. I'm citing data from the Cost of War project at Brown University. So I look at that, right, as a potential starting point for the decline of U.S. hegemony, if not empire, in the Middle East. However, it has been my argument for some time now that democracy is incompatible with empire, or whatever you want to call this, right? And that, yes, you're right, we do have a choice, but we're not using our choice. And to a certain extent, Americans seem to be in a coma when it comes to our military, whatever you want to call it, across the world. We're still spending close to $800 billion annually on defense. The defense budget is actually going up even as we get out of Afghanistan and have pretty much gotten out of Iraq. In other words, we're not fighting any major land wars right now, yet we're still spending oodles of money on defense, more than the next 10 countries combined, despite the fact that we're actually a very safe country. Well, some might say we're safe because of all that spending. I don't know. I know I just threw a lot at you there, but...
Yeah, no, these are excellent points, and I agree with you about the Iraq War. It was a mistake. It was a tragedy. Americans have paid a very heavy price for that, Iraqi citizens, as you mentioned, and many others. Is it an indication that the country itself is in decline? To me, I wouldn't at all, and I don't think that you do this, Martin, but I wouldn't at all equate the decline of American primacy or hegemony with American decline as such. In some respects, I think the more the U.S. is able to set limits, the more the country is going to thrive and prosper.
Right,
so I see that as in part a kind of positive development, that the U.S. looks at the Middle East and doesn't ask the question, where do we need to jump in, but sort of asks more cautious questions at this point. That shows me that perhaps we've learned something from the Iraq War. But I just would flesh out the picture in a somewhat different sense. There are definitely lots of mistakes. You can go back through U.S. history, obviously the Vietnam War before Iraq, and I mentioned the Spanish-American War. That's not one that historians really celebrate, nor do they celebrate the Mexican-American War, although I'm tuning into this from California, which is something that the U.S. acquired during the Mexican-American War of the 1840s. And
that was a war of aggression.
It was a war of aggression, but from a U.S. point of view, maybe with certain sort of mixed results. So there are lots of mistakes the U.S. has historically made and continues to make. But there's also the very remarkable alliance structure that the United States has. And there's the way in which the U.S. underwrites peace and stability in Asia and Europe, not 100%, and there are competitors, obviously, to that in the form of Russia and China at the present moment. But the U.S. really accomplished a lot after 1945 in Europe. It helped to bring peace to the continent for the first time. And I think that Americans are really the beneficiaries of that in many respects, both in Asia and in Europe. It's contributed a lot to our prosperity to have these areas of security, not to have had a third world war after the first two. And that, to me, justifies to a degree the military spending and the military role that the U.S. plays in the world. But it's so easy to go from that kind of underwriting of security role to overreach and to mistakes. To me, it still feels like there's a kind of manageable balance that can be achieved, that we've not gone off the edge to something that's completely unsustainable. But I hope I'm right on that point, because I know that there are many intelligent people who think differently.
We have to see it happen. Again, $800 billion a year, a military budget that is increasing despite the fact we're not fighting any major land wars at the moment. So there is another way of looking at it. And that is, and I happen to subscribe to this position as well, the waning of American hegemony is not such a bad thing for the rest of the world. I mean, and you saw the effect of this in President Biden's recent trip to the Middle East, right? It's clear that U.S. power is not the force it once was. But what was the president's response to that in his remarks to reporters? Well, we're not going to let China and Russia fill the vacuum. Well, maybe it's not such a horrible thing if those countries are free to do what they want with China or Russia.
Right. And I wouldn't make too much of those comments from Biden. They seem to me like instincts or reflexive comments. I doubt that the U.S. is going to up its military presence in Syria because of Russia at the moment. And what the U.S. has to learn in the Middle East and elsewhere is that probably the most effective form of competition with China is going to be economic. And that's a question of not how many wars we fight, but what does the U.S. have to offer a particular country vis-a-vis what China has to offer. And I think Biden kind of gets that in the scheme of things, but that's going to be a learning process for this country for sure. But, Biden is himself a very fascinating case study. It's unfolding before our eyes between a president who agreed, I think, in some respects with President Trump on foreign policy. It's not how Biden campaigned, but he agreed that it was necessary to pull out from Afghanistan. He agreed that the U.S. was probably overcommitted in a number of different places. And you can see elements of this all the way back to the Obama administration, where Obama said it was important to engage in nation building at home rather than nation building abroad. So you have that strain. And as you're suggesting, there's a complexity there, because when Biden looks at Ukraine, it's not a cause for restraint and for caution. He sees a very prominent and important U.S. role. So Biden is in the middle. He's trying to figure out the right balance. In my view, he's not doing that badly. But apart from his actions, his deeds show that he's willing to keep a pretty low profile in a lot of different places.
Well, I support helping the Ukrainians. What I don't like is turning that war or framing that war into some kind of global struggle, an existential threat to democracy the world over. Obviously, it's an existential struggle for Ukraine's independence, right? But, when it comes to this issue, and I know that some of my points, I'm not making them all that clearly here, but I said something before I want to return to. Democracy being incompatible with empire. All these intelligence agencies and the fact that a lot of it is done through privatization, right? We've privatized intelligence gathering. This started under Clinton, or accelerated under Clinton. I think that erodes democracy because it's unaccountable, right? It's unaccountable.
These are very...
that wasn't a question. That was more of a speech that kind of just tailed off there. But go ahead, Michael.
Not at all. These are very strong points. In a way, this takes us to the second part of what Gibbon was discussing, the issue of the Senate. Gibbon wasn't really analyzing a democracy, and he's analyzing an empire, a formal empire, and that wasn't exactly his concern. But I think that what Gibbon would have said about the Roman Empire in terms of the moments, the periods in which it thrived, and there were centuries, sort of first and second century AD, when the Roman Empire was, as Gibbon describes it in his famous first paragraph, it was the most civilized part of the earth, maybe the most civilized moment in all of European history. So it did have a lot of high points. But I think that what Gibbon felt is that over the time, it lost the capacity for mixed government. And that's, I think, what the Senate represented for him, that you have an emperor who makes certain decisions, but there's a dialogue that goes on with the Senate. The Senate can constrain at times the actions of the emperor. What for Gibbon was also very important was rule of law and the sense of Roman legalism. And I think that he felt that over time that stuff all got out of whack. Now, of course, we're in the midst of the January 6th hearings on Capitol Hill, and we could try to translate some of what Gibbon's talking about into contemporary terms. But I have to say, this is what I argue in the essay, that I see no indication that the U.S. The U.S. legislature is giving up its role, is fading away.
Yeah.
I think that obviously there are problems in the American system, and we're sort of working them through or dealing with them or perhaps not dealing with them. But mixed government to me is alive and well in the U.S. and very, very vibrant in many respects, maybe vibrant to the point of being dysfunctional, but it's not on the verge of disappearing as far as I can tell.
What you said in the essay was President Trump, or wannabe autocrat Trump, I'm paraphrasing, didn't dissemble the Senate. Our institutions did hold against the January 6th plot, or whatever we want to call it, a constitutional coup, a mob. Well, when it comes to foreign policy, I think Congress has abdicated its responsibility for far too long. When it comes to January 6th, to your point in your essay, you mentioned how Donald Trump was not able to get rid of the Senate, not able to get rid of Congress and get his way. So our institutions did hold. That is correct. But I often wonder what would have happened had more people gone along with his plot. How strong would our institutions have been? They don't automatically defend themselves. But at the same time, there is a structure there. We have 240-something years of constitutional liberalism, a tradition that, say, the Weimar Republic never had. Comparisons to 1920s Germany are not very helpful when it comes to looking at what we're dealing with in the United States today. On the one hand, Weimar was a tottering, weak democracy without enough Democrats, did not have a rich tradition. Whereas here, a lot of people, Republicans, conservatives, opposed Trump because that constitutional tradition meant a lot to them here.
Well, and I think back to the Trump years, a lot of the tension that Trump experienced, he was fighting multiple battles, as all presidents do, but a lot of the tension that he experienced was with his own party. And that was true on the level of certain cabinet appointments. Maybe it was Jim Mattis who opposed things that Trump wanted to do, but it was definitely true on Capitol Hill. So it's very helpful to bring in Weimar here. What does Hitler do in 1933 when he comes to power? January of 1933, there's a German word for it called Gleichschaltung, where he tried to make all aspects of government alike. And he actually, in a couple of months, succeeded in doing that. And his paramilitary forces started to run the government by late 1933, 1934. And that's how Germany became a one-party dictatorship. Now, I'll be critical of Trump in many respects, but that's completely unlike the Trump years. There was just not any sense of that. There was no paramilitary movement.
Well, there was no way to do it either, right? Like the January 6th plot, there was no way to stop the election at that point. They could cause chaos.
It bears no resemblance to the problems of Weimar. So it's not to say that we should make light of it and say that we're in the clear, but the Weimar stuff, which is very common on social media in the sort of sense that the U.S. is in the twilight of its democracy, yet again, to go back to the beginning of our conversation, I just don't find that it's very persuasive. It's not very well defined. It's not a very illuminating analogy between past and present, but it has that kind of dramatic effect. Because if you say it, oh my gosh, well then the next step is, National Socialism. It certainly gets your attention, but it's not very plausible.
Where it is helpful, it can show you what happens to a democracy when there aren't enough people committed to maintaining it. Well before Hitler's rise, there were German conservative nationalists who were already digging the grave of the Weimar Republic. Monarchists, nationalists, the German military had no use for it. As we said, there was no long tradition there compared to, say, the United States, which has only been around for 246 years if we date it to 1776. But our current Constitution is one of the oldest in the world. So
Americans, this can be a source of pathology in our political culture for sure, but Americans are very, very jealous of their political rights. They will defend them vociferously. Now, at times, this leads to a kind of cacophony in our politics that everybody seems to be defending their rights. We can't agree on what they are. We fight and squabble about that. And it makes our political culture at times very contentious and kind of ugly. I think I'll grant that point.
Well, that's democracy.
But that jealousy of people's rights, that sense that you can't, sort of the don't tread on me motif of American politics, which is very, very strong, is to a degree what Gibbon is talking about when he speaks about the Senate, sort of these forces and powers that are out there that are going to break down sort of extreme dictatorial or authoritarian rule. I don't see that getting weaker in American life. I don't see Americans looking for an alternative to their rights. I see them as sort of as strong in their defense as ever. Yeah. And so to me, again, if we want to speak about decline, I just don't see where it comes together. I don't see where the storyline crystallizes or coheres. It feels to me like the U.S. is in the sort of position where it's been for much of its history, of a huge free-for-all battle when it comes to politics. We all have our ups and downs, our kind of winners and losers within that battle. But again, I don't see it amounting to decline.
Well, I know you don't use the term empire the way I do, but empires, or whatever this is, as I just discussed with my friend and the political theorist Naeem Inaitullah on a recent episode, empires can hang around for a long time. I mean, look at the Ottoman Empire, right? By the time it was finally swept into the dustbin of history, it was tiny compared to what it had been about 600 or 700 years before that. One last point about Weimar, why I also don't think the comparisons work. We don't have a fascist movement in this country, not a mainstream fascist movement.
No.
The Republican Party is not a fascist party. Donald Trump is not a fascist. You could call them illiberal populists who are trying to pervert democracy by denying the validity or the legitimacy of their opponents' electoral wins, but that's not fascism. I think the worst that can be said about Trump and his ilk is that they're trying to pervert democracy so that the only legitimate elections are the ones that they win. That is not akin to what was happening in the Weimar Republic.
It's different. No, I mean, Hitler was
it's a problem, but it's different.
Hitler was the head of a large paramilitary movement that had at its disposal a fanatical ideology. As I argue in the essay, maybe a bit unkindly, but it does seem true to me, there's a kind of egotism or narcissism in the decline argument, because then we can sort of play the heroic role of those figures who were, on the right side of things in the Weimar Republic, but ended up losing out because of Hitler's rise to power. We sort of put ourselves in that very dramatic role. I'm the defender. I'm the last defender of the American Republic. I'm the defender of American democracy. Good that we have as many defenders of American democracy as we do, but I think it's the whole decline thesis is sort of a way of dramatizing almost oneself as a truth teller or a prophet or a romantic defender of democracy, when the situation that we have is more piecemeal, it's more ad hoc. I think it's just less melodramatic than that. As I say in the essay, I think we're going to muddle through, and I hope that we're going to muddle through. But if we muddle through, one of the problems with that, it's a good outcome, and muddling through is kind of what American politics is about. But if we muddle through, it's a bit boring, right? We'll do what we've done for the last 40, 50 years. So the decline argument or the fascism argument is much more exciting. It's much more intellectually interesting.
One of your trenchant observations is that the declinism tropes make it more difficult to actually solve problems.
Yes.
Because you view your opponents, you can't give your opponents an inch because they're the ones bringing on the decline. And almost as if to say, well, what the hell does it matter anyway? We're doomed.
No, exactly. I think that democracy thrives on not just people being jealous of their rights, but on a will to compromise. It does depend, as you noted a moment ago, on accepting election outcomes, peaceful transition of power, and all of that. Let's not be romantic about the American past. You can point to many moments in the past when that stuff was up for grabs, in question, people who tried to game the system. It's not just in the last 10 years that that's been happening, but the demonization of people, to say that my political opponent is not just my political opponent is the vehicle of the country's decline. Well, if that's really true, you probably are justified in taking some extreme measures to make sure that your political opponent doesn't gain power. But then, you end up in a situation where it's very hard to function according to democratic practice.
Well, that was January 6th. Yeah, go ahead.
Each election, you're on the cliff. But I see this on all sides of the political spectrum. I see a lot of people with this sort of melodramatic attitude on the left and a lot of people with that attitude on the right. We need to take a deep breath in this country and take a step back from this kind of demonization. And we don't have to substitute that for that bland arguments that we're in the midst of progress and everything's going to be great and it's all on the up and up. Let's be sober about the problems that we have, but let's not be so apocalyptic about where we're going, because it's going to make the work of democracy more difficult. That's, I think, really the thrust of this essay.
One of my least favorite cliches in American politics is, this is the most important election of your life. Every 4 years, we have another most important election. Well, that's impossible, right? But declinism does have a long history, and not all of its proponents were cranks. George Kennan was a declinist, the architect of American Cold War policy of containment. Let's talk about Kennan. Why did he turn into a declinist?
I think Kennan was born a declinist. He had an unusual personality. He was a loner. He was inclined maybe toward what we would describe now as depression. There was just something that in his character put him on the gloomy side of things that probably made him hard to live with and certainly made him hard to work with, but it also gave him a lot of intellectual insight. So one of Kennan's great skills as an American diplomat, as a thinker about American politics and foreign affairs, that he could be very, very critical of the U.S. And he often was. He was an early opponent of the Vietnam War because he felt like it was the wrong move. And that came in part from his capacity for worry and pessimism. And he could sometimes see behind some of the self-congratulation that's typical to a degree of American politics and of American foreign policy. So it was an asset in a number of ways. But we could also think of Kennan, or at least I do in this respect, as too extreme a pessimist or a kind of cultural conservative of a very pronounced kind. So he couldn't really deal with the country's multiculturalism. He looked at immigration as such, and he saw decline. He was anti-Semitic, and I think for him, the presence of Jews in American public life and politics was a sign of decline. There was a racist side of his character as well. And so part of his declinism was a rejection of multicultural America. So I think that we could safely sort of reject that part of Kennan, but I wouldn't want to throw out everything in terms of Kennan's declinism, because I think his pessimism, his gloominess, it sort of allowed him to see a lot. So you're right, declinism is a danger perhaps, but there are ways in which it can open our eyes to our own problems and our own shortcomings, and that's to the good.
Well, it just occurred to me that some on the left today would say, what decline? The United States was never great to begin with. You mentioned Kennan's, how he was uncomfortable with multiracial democracy. On the left today, there are critics who would say, and they're not wrong about this, the United States wasn't a democracy until the 1960s because you can't have democracy without multiracial democracy. So we've only been around, 250 years, and it took us, I'm not very good at math, but it took us until the 1960s to finally achieve what you might call multiracial democracy. And that experiment, you actually talk about this in your essay, that experiment has seen regress as well as progress.
Decline works a little bit better on the right side of the spectrum. It's a more natural fit to think in terms of decline because at least a more traditionally oriented conservative is going to be committed to something from the past,
yes,
to tradition, a period that comes before us, or to ancestors, to inherited institutions. You think of Edmund Burke, or a lot of 20th century American conservatives have thought in those terms. And so to see decline is almost natural, a falling away, a kind of loss of virtue or a loss of religious piety, faith. A lot of that is sort of second nature to conservatives and to conservatism. So in the essay, I do explore that side of things, and it's important to take into account, but it's not extremely surprising. What's a bit more shocking, I think, is the degree of declinism on the American left. And I'll date it to a particular moment. I think it starts to arise in the second term of President Obama's presidency, when there were a lot of hopes in 2008. That was the sort of motif that Obama ran on. And Obama himself is a great optimist. He's in the tradition of the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice, and civil rights movements are slow, but they yield good benefits. It's there in Obama's memoirs, and it's in his reverence for Martin Luther King and his reverence for Abraham Lincoln. He does believe that life can be made better, and he brought that conviction.
I'm with him on that. Thomas Jefferson said the same thing about human progress. Go ahead.
And Obama is in particular an optimist about America. Not blindly optimistic, but, on balance, quite optimistic. Well, he started to lose that argument with a lot of his supporters, or a lot of people on the left side of the political spectrum, when he was in office. And so there's a whole series of issues. Supreme Court decision, the Dobbs decision, came out after I wrote the essay, but I have seen many people on the left on Twitter and elsewhere say that this is a sign of the country's decline.
To hell with it.
More rights. Yeah. More women had more rights 10 years ago. They had more rights 20 years ago than they have at the moment. The whole take on climate change is one that fits very naturally into a declinist mold, right? We've overrun things. We've gone too far. The profit motive, greed, sort of industrial expansion, economic growth has taken us to the decline of the environment. And as you mentioned in your questions of racial justice, economic equality, a lot of people on the left argue that things are getting worse. That's how George Floyd's murder was interpreted in the summer of 2020, as a sign that things are kind of going downhill. So that to me is more of a surprise. It's a part of our political culture. It's now sort of a feature of our political culture. But the idea that people on the left would be committed to arguments and narratives of decline, to me, it's sort of new. It's sort of very interesting development in American life.
Well, I don't necessarily disagree with the problems they're pointing out, insofar that these problems do exist. I was about to say income inequality. But back to Gibbon and the rise and fall issue.
Yes.
I have not read Gibbon's 6 volumes. I trust that you have. It's not where I believe you read some of them or all of them.
I've read an abridged version of Gibbon. I'll be honest about that.
Okay, well, an abridged version is probably more than most people have read.
Right.
I did read Paul Kennedy's book, The Rise and Fall of Great Powers, Economic Change and Military Conflict from 1500 to 2000. I read it a few years ago. I'd never heard of Paul Kennedy before. This book came out in the 1980s, late 80s, and it's percolating at a time when the United States looks like it's on the top of the world and we've won the Cold War. Francis Fukuyama promulgates his thesis as well about how the U.S. has won this war of ideas. I find that the early 1990s maybe need more attention insofar that maybe that's when the drift begins.
Yeah, I think it's a very helpful point of departure. I'll just note with Paul Kennedy, I think that the date of publication for The Rise and Fall of Great Powers is 1987. The funny thing about that book, it's a wonderful book, and it can teach us so many things at any moment that one reads it. But I'll just say this because of the essay that I've written. The funny thing about that book is that Kennedy and many people at the time were very, very worried about American decline in the 1980s and the ascendancy of Japan. And there was this sense that the Japanese are outproducing us and they have better tech and the economy is just booming. And, 10 years from now, they're going to be way ahead of us. So there is a kind of decline element in the book, a U.S. decline element in the book that resonated then because of Japan. And
those arguments have not aged well, as they would say.
No, they turned out not to be true. So there's, an example of declinist thinking that was overwrought or maybe just not creative enough. Here I will be, a little bit patriotic in this respect, if that's the right word for it. The U.S. is a very creative society. It sometimes uses that creativity to get out of problems of its own creation, perhaps, and it does move forward in often pretty dramatic ways. And so the 1990s that come after the publication of that book, showed a lot of economic dynamism of a kind that the book didn't necessarily predict. But it's a very, very helpful and useful book, and I have great respect for it. But to me, it is an example of how you could predict decline. I don't know if he was exactly predicting American decline. He was thinking about it. But you can predict decline, and it doesn't necessarily come to pass. I'll make one point about the 1990s that I think is important for us.
Please. Yeah.
I think what we're seeing is a kind of correction. And I think an overcorrection. The 1990s was way too optimistic to generalize about that decade. We were too optimistic about globalization. We thought it would bring all kinds of riches to the United States.
Free trade.
Things up, free trade, and make the world democratic and put the U.S. at the center of everything. And globalization brought a lot of problems. The loss of manufacturing and certain kinds of economic inequality and difficulties that a lot of working Americans have that they rightly pin on globalization. And we were way too optimistic in the 1990s about foreign policy. Either through primacy or through persuasion or just through sheer magnetism, we're going to get everybody to agree. And we're going to just live in a kind of perpetually peaceful world order. I mean, that just sounds like such science fiction at the present moment. A lot of people did think in those terms in the 1990s. So what if we signed on to those arguments? Globalization is going to be great and American foreign policy is going to make the world peaceful. If we signed on to those two arguments, we were signing on to a fantasy. And now we're sort of reaping that kind of difficult mood that comes, the hangover that comes after you sign on to a fantasy, and things look very different and they look bleak and it's hard to recalibrate. But I think if we hadn't gone sort of so whole hog in terms of that fantasy, we might be more balanced about where we are today. But part of what we're doing is just correcting from that. And that's, I think, maybe that's a good function of declinism, to sort of break up that over-optimism, but it still doesn't mean that the declinism itself is right and accurate.
Well, I think U.S. leaders drew the wrong lessons from the collapse of the Soviet Union. I mean, there's a great speech, and when I say great, I mean in terms of historical value. George H.W. Bush, Christmas Eve, or Christmas Day, actually, 1991, the day the Soviet Union disappears forever.
The Soviet Union itself is no more. This is a victory for democracy and freedom. It's a victory for the moral force of our values.
We won, they lost, because we were on the right side of history. It wasn't just that the Soviet Union collapsed from within or reformed itself out of existence. This was because of our own greatness. So, getting back to the issue of decline and how difficult it can be to predict, it also can happen when you're not expecting it. The Soviet Union.
After 6.5 years in power, Mikhail Gorbachev confirmed his resignation on television tonight.
Personal decisions, human decisions, had so much to do with the final collapse of the Soviet Union. Decisions that unleashed impersonal forces, I will add.
That's very true. And since you mentioned sort of unexpected, I mean, the 1970s was a pretty great decade for the Soviet Union. A book by a KGB operative, the title of the book is When Everything Was Going Our Way. There was a sense that the third world was shifting toward the Soviet Union. The U.S. was mired in the energy crisis and stagflation and the hangover from the Vietnam War. and that the Soviet Union was on the up and up and was the winning model. There are people who believe that, as intelligent as Henry Kissinger, who believed that in the United States. There certainly were people who believed that in the Soviet Union, and sort of look where things turned out 10 years later. So you're absolutely right. In some ways, the most dangerous moments for a country is when it predicts that everything's going to go well or that it's on the ascendancy. And sometimes the best moments, maybe we can defend ourselves in these terms if everybody is as pessimistic as they seem to be. Maybe the best moments are those moments when there is a bit of self-doubt. When you think of the U.S. in the early 70s, it is truly a very difficult period. Vietnam is a catastrophe for the country, and the economy takes a terrible turn in the early 70s, and you have Watergate, and you have lots of polarization, and the country goes through a period of great declinism. It was very popular in the 1970s to say that the U.S. was in decline, and pessimism and frustration. You see it in the popular culture. You see it in the political culture.
Malaise.
The malaise speech of the late 1970s, and somehow comes out stronger for it. That's a kind of mystery. And maybe we'll be so lucky again as to sort of, kind of work that trick on ourselves, speak for 5 or 10 years about decline and sort of end up in a better place. It's possible.
Well, it'll take some decision-making, right, to address some of these very real problems. I mean, I think the strength of your essay is that you don't deny there are serious problems. But we know what policies are popular, at least according to polls, if you believe polls, that might do something to ameliorate, say, income inequality, which is one of the most important issues, not just in this country, but across the world. About the Soviet Union, when Gorbachev took power in, 85, 86, no one thought the Soviet Union was going to be gone in 5-6 years. And while I think it is true that at some point communism becomes impossible to save, the Soviet Union, the Soviet state, was still salvageable. And Gorbachev did not want to get rid of the Soviet state. He just chose, again to use that term, human choice, he chose not to tighten the clamps of repression.
Yeah, no, it was a series of accidents that led to the unraveling of the Soviet Union. Maybe there's another feature that the U.S. needs to think about is luck. Sometimes luck can come your way. Maybe that's another of the risks of declinism, is that if we really believe it, we might not take advantage of luck when it comes our way. To me, the worst thing about declinism is what it does to us as citizens. Self-government, sort of coming full circle in our conversation, is about the action of citizens. The activities, the political organizing, the investments in the system, voting, forming political parties, running for office. We need an active citizenry. And so I think I come to this point by way of conclusion in the article that if we don't really know whether the country is declining or not, and we can't really know, 100 years from now we will know, then we can say definitively the U.S. was on the way out, it was about to fall apart, or the U.S. was going to sort of find a new version of itself and go forward, or it was really on the up and up. And people just couldn't see it. But if we don't know, then let's choose not to invest in decline, because decline is going to make us passive. It's going to make us feel that, well, whatever we do, it's futile. It's not going to work. The story has already written itself. So if we have a choice here, things being unknown in terms of the future, let's just choose not to invest in this. Let's choose not to believe in this, because it's not the most helpful choice.
Only fools try to predict the future.
Yes.
A friend of mine says.
Let's sort of leave it at that and keep an open mind when it comes to this question. As let's not be foolishly optimistic either, but let's keep an open mind and ground our thinking in the useful actions of the citizenry. That, I think, should be the real focal point of our debate. What are the problems? What are the challenges? What are the solutions? What are the ways of going forward? Kind of end of story. And these very emotional arguments about decline, to me, they just seem like an obstacle. They get in the way of that.
But if we look at this on a global lens, this is where I'll reintroduce Alfred McCoy, who wrote a terrific book this year. He was on the podcast a few months ago, or was it last year? I'm losing track of time, Michael Kimmage, talking about the rise and fall of world orders. And McCoy argues that American hegemony, it's gone, it's going. And he does not think the United States will maintain itself as a global hegemon. It'll become a regional hegemon, and China will grow in power and influence, maybe not into a global hegemon either. We'll have a multipolar world with several large regional hegemons. But McCoy says, and his final chapter is simply brilliant on this, he quotes chapter and verse, one climate change study after another, that the Chinese world order, if you believe China will be next after the United States, is going to be upended before it gets a chance to really establish itself because of this global issue of climate change. This is not a national issue, it's an international issue, and it's going to take some form of global governance. People don't want to give up any of their sovereignty to some type of global governing body. Again, this is not really so much of a question, Professor Kimmage. It's Martin DeCaro rattling on here. But what do you think of McCoy's arguments about how climate change will be the game changer, no pun intended, within the next few decades?
It's hard to be very optimistic about our capacity to make long-term sacrifices for the sake of climate change. I think all of us, Chinese, Russian, U.S., or anything else, we're all going to kind of struggle with that.
Yeah, let me give you a for instance. I'm sorry. He said, for instance, there's a good chance Shanghai will be underwater by 2050. Shanghai being one of the most important financial hubs in the world.
Right, but it's truly a planetary problem, and so we'll only admit a planetary solution, and probably in that sense it's without precedent in international affairs. I mean, you could say that the pandemic was a kind of planetary problem, but we never came up with a planetary solution, and now we're all moving on. So that's not a precedent for how to take global action.
No, that was not a good, let's say, test run for global cooperation.
No, the Danes stealing protective masks from the Germans and that sort of thing, which is very much human nature, but it didn't allow for global solutions to the problem. So I think that that's correct, and probably a new kind of international affairs will come into being. But I want to circle back to something I know a little bit more than I do about climate change, which is the multipolar order. In a certain way, it's a very undramatic statement. I mean, the Cold War was not a time of American hegemony. The Cold War was a time when the U.S. competed very, very vigorously with the Soviet Union, and at times with China, with the communist China. It competed for influence, and it won some of its battles. In West Berlin, it won the battle, and it lost some of its battles in many different parts of the world. It had a lot of ups and downs, but it was definitely bipolar in many respects, multipolar. And I think if you take a more careful look at the 1990s and the period afterwards, you see a lot of multipolarity. And there are lots of parts of the world where the U.S. is not deeply or heavily involved. So, this idea that American hegemony is some kind of benchmark, to me, it's misleading. The question of American foreign policy is always how to navigate a multipolar world. It certainly was in the 19th century when the U.S. was really a very peripheral actor on the global stage. For the first half of the 20th century, the U.S. was sort of content to let it be a multipolar order and let other countries do their work of destruction. Do not go out in search of monsters to destroy and avoid entangling alliances was very well heeded as advice by the U.S. in the first half of the 20th century, and implicitly that contributed to a kind of multipolar order, and that's where we are again. So I think when it comes to multipolarity, we are in a way where we've always been. If we could just wipe away that decade of the 1990s when we thought a little bit differently, it's just healthier to see that we are in the competition for influence and the competition for advantage that's really as old as international affairs.
And I'll add one final point, and you can offer your final thoughts if you don't mind. We conceive of eras and periods after the fact. We think we're living in a certain period today, post-Cold War, post-9/11, whatever, right? I think you even make mention of this in your essay, the post-everything intellectuals. In 50 years from now, we may have different conceptualizations of this period.
Well, I'll answer you, Martin, sort of offer my final words. Since I teach at Catholic University, that we're influenced by a religious view, a worldview at Catholic University. So I'll conclude my remarks with a kind of homily, in a kind of sermonic vein, and say, since I think this to me is the sort of bigger picture thing when it comes to decline, and another aspect of my frustration with how the debate tends to get run in the U.S. at the moment, and one of the reasons I wrote the essay, is that we forget and fail to pay attention to the many, many treasures and blessings that we have around us. This is a very typical sermonic point, but let me make it because I think that it's important. The rights that we have as American citizens are extraordinary. The way in which our political system gets out of the way in many respects. Doesn't always do very brilliantly in terms of delivering the goods, but the way in which it gets out of the way, if you look at many other countries,
Absolutely.
Look at Russia at the moment, where you are now not legally allowed to criticize the war in Ukraine, and think about that in American terms and see how much we have. Inequality is a huge issue, but the affluence of American life is also not to be trifled with. And I mentioned this in the essay, what a vibrant culture we have. The debate, the sheer back and forth, and also the many great movies that are being made, the great novels that are being written, the great music that's being made, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These are banal, in a way, simple points, but I could tally up all of these points and say, look at what we have. And what we have in this respect, to me, is not an indication of decline, and maybe not an indication that things are in such a state of a golden age. Okay, you can acknowledge that, but not to forget the many treasures that are in our possession and that we should value as such, because if we cease to value them as such, we will really miss them when we no longer have them.
Michael Kimmage of Catholic University, we thank you for your insights about declinism and for ending with a shot of optimism. On the next episode of History as It Happens, it'll be back to depressing subjects. Afghanistan, 1 year later. We'll be speaking to Adam Weinstein of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. He'll be joining us from Islamabad, Pakistan. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.